Hello everyone, Nathaniel Gavronsky here, and I am in Nashville at the state capitol building on the grounds here, and right behind me is President James K. Polk. Polk was born in Pineville, North Carolina on November 2nd, 1795. His paternal grandfather and his family moved to a new town called Columbia, Tennessee, the 16th state, which had just become a state in 1796 in the early 1800s. Now, once arriving in Columbia, Samuel was able to James's father was able to become a judge, and it's from this judgeship that he was able to meet the acquaintances of Andrew Jackson, who was a Supreme Court justice here in Tennessee and a former member of Congress and a former senator at this point, as well as being a very popular person in the militia. It was at these early meetings that James Polk and Andrew Jackson's friendship would first start. There was a lot of conversation and debate about how the Polk family was a staunch anti-federalist and a huge supporter of Thomas Jefferson. And this line of debate grew into Polk as he grew older. Polk would set off for the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and would graduate in 1818 at the top of his class, giving his entire graduation speech in Latin. Upon returning to Columbia, he moved in with his at his family's home, which is still standing, and the only home that is original and to the Polk family that still stands today. The Pineville cabin is a reproduction, with the house in Columbia, South Carolina, Columbia, Tennessee, just about 30-minute drive south of Nashville, is the real deal. It's the one he would have actually lived and stayed in. Now, upon returning to Columbia, he took on a law practice, and he also became the clerk of the state senate. Now, the capital of Tennessee kept moving around during this time period, so he got a lot of travels in with him when he was the clerk for the state senate. As Jackson's ascension into politics grew, so did James Polk's. See, he was fine just being the clerk of the Senate, and his law practice was growing, but when the state legislature failed to install Jackson back into the U.S. Senate seat for Tennessee, Polk decided he was going to run for the state house and try to fix this problem. So he successfully runs in 1823 and becomes a member of the state house for the state of Tennessee. Also during this time, he meets Sarah Childers and courts her, and upon encouraging from Jackson, he marries her in the early 1820s, 1823, 24, and they start their lives in the house in Columbia, and then move just about a block away to their marriage house, which is now a parking lot for a funeral home, sadly. But so the next time around, in the 23 cycle for the U.S. Senate seat, Jackson is then elected into the U.S. Senate seat, and that promotes and basically promises that he's going to run for the presidency in 1824. Now, the 1824 election is one of the most corrupted elections in U.S. history. We've had several of them. The 1800 one wasn't all that smooth. The 1812 one wasn't all that smooth either. But this time, this was getting sent to the House of Representatives. And see, Jackson won the popular vote. Jackson also won the majority of the Electoral College votes. However, not enough to get over the requirement he needed to become president. So it was kicked to the House of Representatives. Now, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, did not like Jackson, and the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who was the son of President John Adams, a staunch Federalist, didn't like Jackson's policies either. And so they decided that they were going to do a little bit of dealing. So Clay, who came in third, sent all of his support to Quincy Adams and told everyone else to do the same. And that was able to put Quincy Adams just over Jackson, and just enough to become president. That being said, this was probably one of the worst administrations in American history. The John Quincy Adams administration was a disaster for the Whigs, and they fell out of favor very quickly. And when Jackson promised that he was going to run in 28, he ran away with it. The election wasn't even really all that close. He was able to easily get his electoral votes in. He becomes president, and with this, because of what happened in 24, James Polk runs for the U.S. House and wins. Now, Polk, once he becomes a member of the House, and then Jackson becomes the president, Jackson makes sure that Polk gets the committee chair for the Ways and Means Committee, because Jackson has a lot of economic and financial and banking regulations that he wants to change and alter, and Polk is his number one ally, and so Polk kind of ascends with Jackson. Now, as Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson is known by, because of this alliance between Polk and the State House of Tennessee, and now as a U.S. representative for the state of Tennessee, Polk gets the name Young Hickory, knowing that with Jackson's success will come Polk's. And Polk is a great ally to Andrew Jackson during his time in the House. He opposed everything that Adams tried to do when Adams was president, and as they're going through, Jackson wins his 2 terms. But he wants to make sure that Polk is well taken care of, and because he needs more support, he assures that Polk becomes Speaker of the House in the last 2 terms of his period in the House of Representatives. Now, Jackson leaves the White House, and his chosen successor, Martin Van Buren, comes in, and Van Buren and Polk start off right where Jackson left off. They are moving along, but they are running into some problems. Jackson's policies actually created some economic turmoil in the late 1830s, and Van Buren was even discussing with Polk on if they should undo some of Jackson's policies, but they decided that it was against it because Jackson would be observant of this and would not look at them favorably. But because of the policies were so damaging to the state of Tennessee, Jackson's and Polk's home state, went Whig. And the writing was on the wall by 38, realizing that, yes, he's a Speaker of the House, but the chances of him winning re-election in 39 were very unlikely. So instead of maintaining his seat in the House and the Speaker of the House, Polk leaves the House of Representatives, returns to Tennessee, and runs for governor. Now, all of Tennessee has become Whig at this point, and Jackson's retirement at the Hermitage in a Whig state does not suit his fancy. And so Polk comes in thinking he's going to win the election of 39, and he's going to show that the Jacksonian era politics is still alive and well, and he wins for 1 term. By the next election, Polk is defeated handedly. And then 2 years later, he tries to run again for the governor and is clearly beaten. I mean, at this point, Polk is down and out. Jackson retired, Van Buren losing his bid for re-election in 1840 due to the same policies that were keeping Polk from winning the governor's mansion in Tennessee. It was because the Jacksonian era politics was kind of coming to an end, and the Whigs started to dominate, or so they thought. See, Polk thought he could, get on the coattails of Van Buren's 2nd term. That didn't work out, and he started planning on what to do next. The Whigs with Harrison, who became president, he died like 90 days after he got inaugurated. Tyler, his vice president, becomes president, and this becomes an interesting story because he's the first one to advance to the presidency, and that had never actually been done before. So a lot of people said, no, you can't do it. You must maintain the vice president. He said, no, if anyone sends me correspondence saying vice president, I won't respond, and I'll send it back. This actually was so contentious that the idea of Tyler being the 10th president was actually, not secured. In fact, there's a stained glass window in Columbia, just a county quarter to the Polk residence, that shows Polk in the glass. It shows him as the 10th president. At the time this was made, he was considered the 10th president because Tyler and Harrison were considered to be one. And Tyler lost the favor of his party, the Whigs, and they wouldn't re-nominate him for the presidency. And so there would be no incumbent in the 44 election cycle. And so Van Buren plans on running again in 44, and Polk decides, well, the vice president under Van Buren, Johnson, is not going to be running clearly as the predominant person, so maybe I have a chance of becoming the vice president under Van Buren. Here's the problem, though. During this time period, the Jacksonian time period, mostly, it was all about expansion and the problems with expansion. See, Jackson had recognized Texas's independence in 1835, but nothing happened since. He had hoped to annex it, but his term ran out, and Tyler wasn't for sure if that was going to be a good idea because of the question of expansionism and what would happen to those new territories. Would they become free or would they become slave? And the North didn't really want to see the expansion of slavery. And the South wanted to be able to see how each state they could either become free or slave on their own, with the rules of 2 states coming in at a time, 1 slave, 1 free. Ultimately, this is the balance in the U.S. Senate. The Senate's balance is tremendously important during this time period because you had 2 Democrats and 2 Whigs. Later, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. Even after the Civil War, this practice continued. There's the reason why there's 2 Dakotas, is because they had 2 western states out of the Oregon Territory that needed to become states, but they only had the Dakota, which they believed was going to be coming in as, you know, a strong Democrat state, and the northwestern states were going to be coming in as Republican. So in order to do that, they had to cut the Dakotas into 2, so they would have 2 Republican states and 2 Democrat states for the 2 Northwest Republican states. And that's how it was done all the way up until the 1959, 1960, when Alaska and Hawaii also came in as a Republican and a Democrat state. So this was a long, drawn-out process about how the balance in the Senate was going to take place. There's a reason why the Senate is still close to always, 50-50. There's very few times where you see the Senate have a strong, huge majority of either party. This debate was happening during this time period, and so the question on annexation of Texas was huge. Now, Van Buren, being a Northern Democrat and the former governor of New York, didn't want to upset the northern members of his party and the North as a whole. And Calhoun, who also was trying to win favor, and Johnson trying to win favor, they all spoke out against annexation of Texas. And Polk was the only one who spoke in favor of annexation of Texas. And that made Jackson say, this is my guy. I'm no longer going to support Van Buren. And he told, so there was a private meeting between Jackson and Polk where Jackson said to Polk, I'm going to promote you as the president, as the top of the ticket. This was all done in quiet. The 1844 cycle came through, and the convention had a lot of questions on, was annexation going to take place? There was also a question on the Oregon Territory. The staunch platform of the Democratic Party was to take all of the Oregon Territory and to take Texas all the way to the Rio Grande and then take California. So because they had 2 candidates, that the main ones, Van Buren and Calhoun, who were anti-expansion, anti-annexation, and wrote letters to the editor and made it publicly known they were not for annexation, they both had a hard time getting any traction. But once Polk's name was suggested, which was all part of Jackson's ploy, Van Buren supporters left him and went to Polk. And then as it kept going, by the 9th ballot, Polk had it. And the ascension of the dark horse was coming. The reason why he's known as the dark horse is that he was down and out. No one really knew what his plans were for his presidency. It was questionable just what he would do. He basically kept his entire time as the Democratic nominee, with all of his answers being ambiguous. During this time period, no one really campaigned or electioneering. They kind of stayed home and they let their proxies do all their bidding and talking. And this is true all the way up past Lincoln, all the way up into the 20th century, where the candidates for president kind of stayed quiet and had all the proxies do all the talking for them. We still see that a lot today on cable news. So he gets in. Now here's the thing about Texas. Tyler, who's still president, who has no party affiliation, just decides to, I'm going to annex Texas. So in the last moments of his time as president, he gets the Senate to finally agree to annex Texas. The Senate agrees, they send it down, and the courier is traveling to Texas while Polk is inaugurated. Polk tells him, go ahead, go do it. Let's see what Texas says. Texas agrees to the rules and to the conditions of annexation and becomes the 28th state. So as Polk comes in, Mexico is quite upset with the United States, but Polk also has the problem with the Oregon Territory. So Oregon comes in as being a property that was co-owned by the British and the United States. Not wanting a war, Polk goes and notifies the British that he plans on ending the cohabitation, the co-ownership of the Oregon Territory. When he negotiates this, they are able to come up with an agreement along the 49th parallel. This is the current border of the United States now. Now, the American position was to take it all the way up to the Russian border with Alaska, and the British obviously wanted it all the way down to the border of Mexico. But the border of British Canada, North America, and the United States had been on the 49th parallel all the way across, except for one little part of Minnesota. So it just became easier to keep the 49th parallel thing. The one thing that was the exception was all of Vancouver Island was agreed to be given to the British North America, and that was pretty easy now, but at the time there was a possibility of going to war with England over this. But the British weren't really wanting to stir up, making the War of 1812 a continuance. So the British decided that this far away territory wasn't that important to get a war for. Polk didn't want to go to war because he knew that the Texas conflict was coming. So very early on, one of his first promises was to settle the Oregon country situation, which he did. Now, Polk promised to be only one term, so everything he was going to accomplish was going to be done in a very short time period. One of the next things he wanted to do was actually create an independent treasury. See, Jackson got rid of the Second Bank of the United States, which put the country in a pretty big bind. This bind was what ruined Van Buren's presidency and also destroyed Tyler's attempt at being a successful president. So getting this to work was going to be very hard because the Whigs weren't in favor of anything the Democrats were promising. So he was working on this independent treasury. He also had to work on a tariff situation with South Carolina and many other southern states, because Jackson and the South Carolina had an issue with a nullification act South Carolina did on federal tariffs. It was a questionable situation, and Polk needed to create peace. He was able to do that. Polk was able to get his independent treasury, and this system lasted for all the way up until 1913, 1919, as we began to create the Federal Reserve System. So the independent treasury created by Polk financed the U.S. Civil War and the industrialization of the country as a whole. It also helped starve off two major financial panics in the late 1800s, allowing the United States to keep building up its economic power. And World War I was mostly financed out of this independent treasury system that was the precursor to our current day Federal Reserve System. The biggest other thing was the Texas situation. So this is very controversial because Texas declared its independence. Jackson had recognized it. Tyler had made it a state, but they didn't know officially where the southern border was. The United States claimed the Rio Grande was the southern border. Mexico had other say in that. And so Jackson sent down Zachary Tyler, who was a Whig general, to this area along the Rio Grande to kind of scope it out, see what's going on. He also hoped that he sent a large force down there, that Mexico would just, sue for peace, not want to go to war. He was wrong. Mexico and Tyler's armies got into a little clash where 15 American soldiers were killed. This did not sit well in Washington or with Polk. And so the question about going to war was very, very quick. And once Mexico started suiting up for war, Polk asked Congress for a declaration of war, and he got it. So the war basically started in the kind of 1845, 1846, as it was kind of a slow rolling thing. A lot of battles were happening where Jackson's generals were winning battle after battle after battle after battle. They weren't listening to him necessarily on what they want to do, but they were all the way down. They were taking Mexican territory left and right, and which caused a problem for Polk, because the question on expansion, how much territory of Mexico are we going to take, and is that territory going to be free or slave? So this thing kept dogging him his entire administration, and so he needed to find a way to settle this. And so his Buchanan, who was in his cabinet went down there and tried to work with the Mexican government. He had several other people come down to the Mexican government. Nothing was working. He figured, well, I have this exiled former Mexican leader in Cuba, Santa Anna. Let's bring him back over. Maybe he'll have a coup, and maybe he'll sue for peace. So Polk got Santa Anna back to Mexico City, and the first thing Santa Anna did was call up to arms and fight against the Americans. He probably prolonged the war more than anything else that had happened, was the return of Santa Anna. So Polk really had a hard time managing this war. He kept trying to offer $30,000, $30 million. You're trying to get this take money. I mean, the America's idea is we'll just buy everything. That's how we end up getting Florida. We bought it. But the Mexicans weren't having it. At the same time, he had people in California who were also, no longer secretly pushing to take California for the United States, and they were winning battles. It wasn't until the fact that it was very clear that Mexico was going to just keep losing the territory and lose it hard, because all of California was now clearly in the United States' hands. It wasn't going well for the Mexicans. The United States didn't want to have to take over all of Mexico, because the Congress, which was mostly at this point opposition party, wasn't going to continue funding the war effort because they were worried about expansion and slavery in the southern territories, and the expansion would be all slave, which would really terribly upset the balance in the Senate. So it came to the point to where they were going to agree on a treaty. There was a treaty that was created in February of 1848, and that treaty was then sent up to Washington. It was agreed upon by March by the U.S. Senate. It was then returned to Mexico City, and in June it got back to Polk that in fact the Mexicans did agree to the treaty. Basically, with the exception of the very, very southern part of like New Mexico, which would become the Gadsden Purchase, which took place under Franklin Pierce, all of the continental part of the United States, the borders were secured by Polk. The treaty was agreed upon, and on July 4th, 1848, the war was over, officially. Promising again like he wasn't going to run for re-election, the hero of the War of Mexico and the United States, Zachary Taylor, he ran for president as a Whig and won. Now, Polk wasn't a big fan of this idea. He didn't like it, but he promised he was only going to run for one term, and that's what he did. On another international issue, New Granada, which is now Panama, he actually negotiated a treaty and helped create a military alliance with New Granada, which is Colombia, and Panama, and allowed for a railroad to be built there. This railroad actually helped the United States get goods back and forth between the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. Forget the Transcontinental Railroad isn't built yet, so they were using Panama as a way for shipping lanes. This railroad was actually being rehabilitated and used during the construction of the Panama Canal in the early 20th century. If it wasn't for the railroad that Polk helped negotiate, the Panama Canal might have had a much, much different outcome, because it got very, very questionable how successful this was going to be. So Polk, in 4 years, accomplished all of his goals. He got his independent treasury. He got tariffs changed and altered for American business and agricultural industry. He settled the borders. He did everything he set out to do, and then he quietly left in March of 1849 and went on a pre-planned tour of the South. Became very ill. They almost thought about canceling part of the tour, but he was so popular and so well regarded in New Orleans that he decided to keep going. From New Orleans, he came back up to Nashville and settled into Polk Place. He got a little bit of respite, and he started to show some signs of life and coming back vigorous. But then again, he started getting sick again, and by June 15th, 1849, the end was near, and he called for a Methodist priest. He wanted to be baptized as a Methodist, even though his entire family was Presbyterian. He wanted to be a Methodist. He actually used to sneak out when his wife couldn't go to church to go to a Methodist church. But so he was baptized as a Methodist on his deathbed and died, telling his wife over and over and over again how much he loved her. She would outlive him for over 40 years. and would bring in an adopted daughter that would live in Polk Place. The Polk Place is a very, very tragic story on the presidential estates. It's a very interesting story for another time, but his burial, along with Sarah's, was at Polk Place. But in the late 1800s, they had to move it to the Capitol building here, and Polk Place was demolished in 1901. There's been questions about moving the burial grounds here in 2017, but they didn't really go anywhere. They were going to move them back down to Columbia, but that never happened. So here is James K. Polk and his wife, Sarah Childers Polk, and may they rest in peace. One of the most epic presidents in our entire history. He doesn't get much credit for it today, mostly because, you know, the slavery issue. A lot of presidents from the South pre-Civil War are kind of ignored for their greatness because they did own slaves. It was well known that Jackson's entire wealth was through the slave trade, and even his own museum says that Polk owned slaves. And so it's very hard for people today to acknowledge the greatness that they did do because of the slavery issue. And slavery was a horrible stain on American history, and these men's reputations have suffered greatly for it. Interesting thing, though, is that a lot of the slaves they did have, even after they were set free, stayed with the family for quite some time in both Jackson's and Polk's case, because they were part of the family. They were no longer. It is what it is. Slavery. There was no justification for slavery, but it was common for slaves after the wars were over to stay in the plantations, and they were paid. It was a slow process of slavery, the institutional slavery ending, and I'm grateful that a lot of some of our greatest cultural attributions are from the ancestors, the descendants of slaves. And we have a lot of culture, we have a lot of great things that the descendants of slaves have provided for this country, and I'm grateful for their cultural attributions. I just wish that they were able to claim their American heritage in a way that wasn't so much associated with slavery. But here lays James K. Polk, the 11th President of the United States. I hope you enjoyed this video. Yes, I know it was a long one, but there's not much about him, so I wanted to really make sure to go into some of the greater details. Please come check out the Capitol building here in Nashville. It's a very beautiful place. The grounds are amazing. Great views of the city. I hope you like this video. Please like it. Please share it. Subscribe to my channel so you can get more views. I'm on my way off east. Stay healthy, stay wealthy, and as always, stay wise, America.